in the harsh autumn of 1883, high in the Colorado Rockies, near what would become Telluride, a wagon train of settlers preparing for their first mountain winter watched Hugh Cameron build what they called the most foolish shelter they'd ever seen. The Scottish immigrant, barely 2 years removed from the Highlands where he'd worked as a stonecutter, was raising a structure that looked more like an Indian lodge than a proper cabin, with walls that sloped sharply inward and a roof peaked so steep it seemed ready to pierce the sky. While his fellow settlers hurried to complete their traditional rectangular cabins with sturdy flat roofs designed to hold snow, Hugh worked alone on his strange dwelling, and the mockery came swift and relentless. What none of them understood, watching him haul timber and stone through the aspen groves, was that before winter's end, an avalanche would thunder down the mountainside and prove which design truly belonged in these peaks. Hugh Cameron had come to Colorado Territory after his wife's death in Scotland, seeking distance from grief and a new start for himself and his young daughter Mary. He joined a wagon train in Denver, drawn by tales of silver strikes and the promise of land, and when the group reached a promising valley hemmed in by towering peaks, they decided to settle before the first snow. The valley sat at the base of a massive slope, with the nearest established mining camp a full day's hard ride to the east. Most of the settlers were farmers from the Midwest, men like Jacob Porter and William Anderson, who knew corn and cattle, but had never seen a mountain that touched the clouds. They built what they knew, solid cabins with strong beams and roofs pitched just enough to shed rain, the same structures that had served them well in Missouri and Kansas. Hugh had watched the mountains differently from the start. Coming from the Scottish Highlands, he recognized the way snow gathered on the upper slopes, saw how the wind carved patterns in the exposed rock faces, noticed the old scars on the valley floor where ancient slides had stripped away everything in their path. The valley was beautiful, with a cold stream running through it and timber enough for a dozen homesteads, but those scars troubled him. One evening in early September, as the settlers laid out their building sites, Hugh climbed partway up the slope behind the valley. From there, he could see the whole basin spread below, and he noticed something that made his chest tighten. The valley sat directly in the throat of a massive natural chute, a place where gravity would funnel anything that broke loose above. The old slide paths weren't just random. They followed the same devastating line, again and again. When Hugh tried to explain his concerns at that night's campfire, suggesting they might relocate to higher ground on the valley's edge, the other men dismissed him outright. Jacob Porter, who'd established himself as the informal leader of the group, laughed and said they hadn't come this far to perch on a hillside like mountain goats. The valley floor offered flat land, water, and easy access to timber. William Anderson added that they'd need to finish their cabins before the first snow, and moving the building sites now would cost them precious weeks. Hugh pressed on, trying to describe what he'd seen in Scotland, how snow could break loose and flow like water, but the men had never witnessed an avalanche and couldn't picture what he meant. They saw only a nervous foreigner afraid of his own shadow, trying to complicate what should be simple. Faced with their refusal to relocate, Hugh made a decision that deepened their ridicule. If they were going to build in the valley, he would build for what he knew was coming. He'd spent 2 winters in a Highland shepherd's cottage built into a hillside, and he'd seen how certain shapes weathered storms better than others. He'd also spent time among the Ute people during his first year in Colorado, and he'd watched how their lodges shed wind and snow without effort. What he conceived was something between the two, a shelter designed not to resist the mountain's force, but to let it pass. He would build with steeply sloped walls that met at a sharp peak, angled so severely that nothing could accumulate or catch. The other settlers thought he'd lost his mind. Jacob Porter openly said Hugh was wasting good timber, while William Anderson suggested the poor widower's grief had addled his thinking. But Hugh had made his choice, and he set to work with his daughter, watching from the wagon. The structure Hugh envisioned required more planning than a traditional cabin. In late September, with aspens turning gold on the mountainsides, he began selecting timber from the forest above the valley. He needed logs of similar length and thickness, straight enough to set at steep angles without warping. He spent nearly a week choosing and felling, looking for pines with minimal taper, each about the span of a man's shoulders in length and thick as a strong man's thigh. His neighbours, already framing their own cabins, shook their heads as they watched him sort through perfectly good timber, rejecting logs they would have used without hesitation. He needed more than 3 dozen logs for the frame alone, each one hauled down the slope by horse and laid out in the meadow near where he'd staked his claim. The foundation took him another week to prepare. Unlike his neighbours, who simply cleared ground and set corner posts, Hugh dug into the earth itself, creating a circular foundation pit about the width of a large room, deep enough to stand in without his head clearing the surface. He lined the pit with stones from the creek bed, fitting them together with the precision of his stonecutter's training, building up walls that would extend above ground level by about the height of a man's chest. His neighbours found this even more baffling. Jacob Porter stopped by one afternoon and asked if Hugh was building a grave or a house. William Anderson suggested he was wasting energy that should go toward raising walls and a roof. They couldn't understand why anyone would burrow into the ground when they needed protection from what came from above. With the foundation complete, Hugh began raising the frame in early October, and this was when the true peculiarity of his design became apparent to everyone. He set the logs at angles so steep that a man could barely keep his footing on them if they were laid flat on the ground. The walls rose from the stone foundation like the sides of a ute lodge, but instead of hide or canvas, Hugh planned to cover them with overlapping layers of split timber and stone. At the centre, where all the angled logs met, he created a peak topped with a stone cap he'd shaped himself, designed to shed anything that struck it. The whole structure, when viewed from the side, looked like a child's drawing of a mountain, triangular and sharp. Standing finished, it rose higher than the traditional cabins around it, but most of that height was empty air beneath the peaked roof. The other settlers didn't hide their opinions. Sarah Porter, Jacob's wife, told Mary Cameron that her father had built them a wigwam instead of a proper Christian home. William Anderson joked that Hugh must be expecting to trade furs with the Indians from inside his lodge. The children called it the Teepee House and made a game of running circles around it while Hugh worked. Even the few who tried to be kind suggested gently that Hugh might want to reconsider before winter, that there was still time to build something more conventional. But Hugh continued, and as October deepened and the first light snows dusted the peaks above, he began the painstaking work of covering his frame. The covering process revealed Hugh's full intention. He split pine logs into boards, each about as wide as a man's hand and as long as a man could reach. He laid these in overlapping layers on the steep walls, like scales on a fish, or shingles on a roof, starting from the bottom and working up toward the peak. Between each layer of wood, he added a layer of smaller stones, fitted tightly together. The pattern repeated, wood and stone, creating a wall thicker than a man's forearm through most of its length. The weight would have collapsed a conventional frame, but the steep angle of the walls transferred the load directly downward into the stone foundation. The settlers watched this labour with genuine confusion now, beyond mere mockery. They couldn't fathom why anyone would make a shelter so heavy, so complicated, when simple log walls chinked with mud had served frontier families for generations. By the time the first serious snows arrived in mid-November, Hugh's shelter stood complete. The entrance faced away from the prevailing winds, a low doorway that required anyone entering to duck their head. Inside, the space was smaller than a traditional cabin of similar height, the steeply sloped walls stealing floor space in exchange for that soaring peak. Hugh had built a stone hearth in the centre, with a chimney that rose straight through the peak, and around the circular wall he'd created built-in stone benches that would serve as beds and seating. The whole interior felt cave-like, dark and close, nothing like the open rectangular rooms his neighbours enjoyed. Mary had her own concerns about the strange dwelling, but she trusted her father and helped him move their possessions inside. The first test came with an early storm in late November, 3 days of steady snow that laid down more than a foot across the valley. Hugh and Mary stayed warm inside their shelter, the thick walls holding heat from the central fire in a way that surprised even Hugh. He'd expected the shelter to be functional, but the stone and wood layers seemed to trap warmth like a Dutch oven, and they burned less than half the wood he'd anticipated. Meanwhile, in the traditional cabins scattered across the valley, families huddled near their fireplaces and watched snow pile up on their roofs. The rectangular cabins stayed warm enough, their fires roaring, but they consumed wood at an alarming rate. After the storm passed and neighbours ventured out to check on each other, they noticed something peculiar about Hugh's teepee shelter. Not a single flake of snow remained on its surface. The steep pitch had shed everything, leaving the structure completely bare, while every other roof in the valley wore a heavy white blanket. Jacob Porter, inspecting his own cabin's roof and calculating how much weight it would need to bear by winter's end, grudgingly admitted that Hugh's design had one advantage, but he quickly added that shedding snow was hardly worth the extra months of labour and the loss of usable interior space. William Anderson agreed, pointing out that their roofs were built to hold snow anyway, and the insulation it provided actually helped keep their cabins warm. Hugh said nothing, just nodded and went back to gathering firewood. But he'd noticed something his neighbours hadn't. When snow fell on their flat or gently pitched roofs, it didn't just sit there. It began to build up, layer after layer, and each new storm added to what the previous one had left. By mid-December, some of the cabin roofs groaned under loads that must have weighed as much as several full-grown cattle. Hugh's real insight, though, wasn't just about roof pitch and snow shedding. It was about what happens when something massive strikes a structure. In the Scottish Highlands, he'd seen what high winds could do to buildings that presented flat surfaces to a storm. He'd watched gales tear roofs from solid stone cottages, seen walls collapse inward when wind found purchase. The sharp angle of his shelter's walls was designed on the same principle as the prow of a ship, to split resistance rather than meet it head-on. He'd tried to explain this to William Anderson one afternoon in December, using the analogy of how a wedge splits wood while a flat blade gets stuck. But William had just laughed and said they weren't expecting any ship attacks in the Colorado mountains. Hugh had smiled at the joke and let it drop, but in his mind he kept seeing those old Avalanche scars on the valley floor, kept calculating angles and forces. The winter of 1883 to 1884 proved brutal even by mountain standards. By January, The snow depth in the valley reached past a tall man's waist in the drifts, and the settlers began to worry about their livestock and dwindling wood supplies. The traditional cabins held up well enough, though several roofs required additional interior bracing to support the accumulated snow weight. Hugh's shelter continued to shed everything, standing bare and dark against the white landscape like an arrow pointing at the sky. The contrast had become so notable that it was a common topic of conversation when the settlers gathered. Some had begun to reassess their initial mockery, wondering if maybe Hugh's design had more merit than they'd given it credit for. But most still considered it an oddity, interesting but impractical for real frontier living. Then came the warm spell in late January, 3 days when temperatures rose high enough that snow began to melt even at their elevation. The settlers welcomed the break from the cold, hanging laundry outside, and letting their children play in the slushy snow. But Hugh grew increasingly worried. He'd climbed partway up the slope behind the valley and seen what the warmth was doing to the massive snowpack above. Layers that had been stable and frozen were now saturated with meltwater, heavy and unstable. On the 3rd day of warmth, he told Mary to gather their most precious possessions and be ready to run if he gave the word. She'd learned to trust her father's instincts, even when she didn't understand them, and she packed a bag without question. That evening, as the sun set and temperatures began to drop again, Hugh stood outside his shelter and listened to the mountain. It's hard to explain how he knew, but something in the silence felt wrong, like the moment before thunder when all the birds go quiet. He called Mary outside and told her they needed to spend the night in the open, away from the valley floor. She looked at him with wide eyes, and he saw the question there, but she didn't argue. They gathered blankets and moved to a rocky outcrop about 100 yards up the slope from their shelter, a spot where the bedrock broke through and offered something solid to sit against. Other settlers, seeing Hugh and Mary leave their warm shelter to camp in the cold night, thought the Scotsman had finally gone completely mad. The avalanche came just after midnight, and those who survived it would remember the sound for the rest of their lives. It started as a deep rumble, like distant thunder but continuous, growing louder. Then came a roar that seemed to shake the earth itself, and a wall of snow and ice came pouring down the mountain chute Hugh had identified months before. The mass moved with terrible speed, a churning mixture of snow, ice, rock, and broken trees that filled the valley like a flood. In the cabins, families had perhaps a handful of seconds to realize what was happening, not nearly enough time to escape. The avalanche struck the settlement with the force of a great river breaking through a dam. The rectangular cabins, strong as they were, met the flowing snow with flat walls and right angles that caught and held the pressure. The massive weight bore down on them, and one by one the structures collapsed, walls folding inward and roofs caving under tons of ice and debris. Jacob Porter's cabin, hit almost directly, was smashed to kindling in seconds. William Anderson's home, slightly to the side of the main flow, lasted longer, but eventually buckled as snow filled every gap and pressed from all sides. Other cabins throughout the valley suffered similar fates, some destroyed completely, others buried but partially intact beneath the snow. Hugh's shelter, directly in the avalanche's path, met the snow differently. The sharp angles of the walls sloped steeply like the prow of a ship, split the flow. Snow and debris struck the structure and were diverted up and around, following the path of least resistance rather than building up pressure. The heavy stone and timber construction, designed to transfer weight directly into the deep foundation, absorbed the impact and held firm. The avalanche flowed over and around the shelter like water around a stone in a river, the peaked top shedding debris as it had shed the season's snowfall. When the roaring finally stopped and the mountain fell silent again, Hugh's shelter stood largely intact, visible above the new snow level, while the traditional cabins had vanished beneath the flow. As dawn broke on a devastated valley, survivors began to emerge from the snow. Not everyone had died. Some families had been thrown clear or found air pockets in the debris, and others had been in outbuildings or barns that somehow withstood the slide. But the toll was terrible. Jacob Porter had been killed along with his eldest son, though Sarah and her daughters survived. William Anderson's family had all escaped through a window before their cabin collapsed, suffering injuries but alive. In total, 7 people were dead and more than a dozen injured, and every single traditional cabin in the settlement had been destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Hugh and Mary came down from their rocky perch as the sun rose, and the sight that met them seemed impossible. Where a community of cabins had stood, there was now a field of snow and debris, broken timber and scattered possessions marking where homes had been. But rising from this destruction, stark and unmistakable, stood Hugh's strange shelter. Not untouched, chunks of the outer covering had been torn away, and the entrance was partially blocked, but the structure itself had held. The stone foundation remained solid, the steep walls intact, the peaked top still pointing at the sky. William Anderson, bleeding from a gash on his forehead and helping dig through debris to find missing neighbours, stopped when he saw Hugh approaching. The look that passed between them held no words at first, just a recognition that passed deeper than language. Finally, William spoke, his voice rough with exhaustion and grief. He said he should have listened months ago when Hugh wanted to move the settlement. He said he understood now what those old scars on the valley floor had meant, and he said that if they rebuilt, he would build it Hugh's way, with walls that shed the mountain's fury, rather than trying to resist it. The survivors spent the next days and weeks digging out what they could and mourning their dead. Many chose to leave the valley entirely, unable to face rebuilding in a place that had taken so much. But those who stayed did so with new understanding. That spring, as the snow melted and revealed the full scope of the destruction, they began to rebuild. This time, they built with steep walls and peaked roofs. Hugh shared his knowledge freely, showing them how to angle the logs, how to create foundations that channeled force downward, how to think about the mountain's power instead of fighting it. The new structures looked nothing like the traditional frontier cabins they'd grown up with, but they looked exactly right for the place they'd chosen to call home. Hugh's original shelter stood for more than 2 decades after that terrible night, serving first his family and later others who settled in the valley. The settlement that grew up around it never forgot the lesson of the avalanche. When mining companies came through looking to build camps higher up the slopes, the locals advised them on building designs that might survive the mountains. Some listened, some didn't, and the pattern repeated itself in other valleys throughout the Rockies as settlers learned, sometimes through tragedy, how to live in such unforgiving terrain. The shelter itself eventually gave way not to avalanche, but to simple time and weather, the logs rotting and the stones finally settling into the earth. But before it fell, it had served 3 different families through countless winters, had weathered a dozen lesser slides, and had stood as a monument to the simple truth that observation and adaptation matter more than tradition when you're facing something you've never encountered before. By the time it was finally abandoned in the early 1900s, the valley held more than a dozen structures built on Hugh's principles, a small community that had learned to live within the mountain's rules rather than pretending those rules didn't exist. There's something profound in Hugh Cameron's story that extends beyond the technical details of roof pitch and wall angles. Here was a man who saw what others couldn't or wouldn't see, who understood that survival in a new place requires learning from that place, rather than imposing old assumptions onto it. The other settlers weren't fools or bad people. They were simply building what they knew, using methods that had worked in Missouri and Kansas and 100 other places they'd left behind. Hugh's advantage wasn't superior intelligence, but humility, a willingness to observe and adapt rather than assume. The tragedy is that the lesson had to be learned through death. 7 lives might have been saved if the settlers had listened in September instead of January, if they'd seen the old Avalanche scars as warnings instead of ancient history. But that's often how human beings learn, not through cautious wisdom, but through painful experience. What matters is what we do with those lessons once we've learned them. The survivors of that 1884 avalanche didn't waste their second chance. They rebuilt with knowledge earned in blood and grief, and they passed that knowledge down to those who came after. Today, in mountain communities throughout the Rockies and beyond, you can still see echoes of Hugh Cameron's insight. Buildings with steeply pitched roofs, foundations that extend deep into the earth, structures designed to work with natural forces rather than against them. We call it snow load engineering now, give it technical names and calculate it with mathematics Hugh never learned, but the fundamental principle remains the same. When you build in the mountains, you build for what the mountains can do, not for what you wish they would do. That's not pessimism, it's respect. The kind of respect that keeps people alive. The story of Hugh Cameron and his teepee shelter reminds us that sometimes the most ridiculed ideas turn out to be the most necessary ones. Innovation often looks like foolishness right up until the moment it proves itself, and the person willing to endure mockery for what they know to be true performs a service for everyone, even those doing the mocking. Hugh didn't build his strange shelter to prove a point or to show off. He built it because he'd read the mountain correctly and wanted his daughter to survive the winter. That his design ended up saving the concept, if not always the lives of his neighbours, was almost incidental to his original purpose. If you found value in this story, in remembering this Scottish stonecutter who brought Highland wisdom to Colorado peaks, consider subscribing to this channel. Every like, every comment, every share helps keep these stories alive, helps ensure that the practical genius of people like Hugh Cameron doesn't get lost in the sweep of time. There are hundreds of these stories out there, scattered through the frontier territories, waiting to be told. Tales of people who observed carefully, thought differently, and survived where others couldn't. Share your own stories if you know them, the frontier wisdom passed down through your own family. These memories matter. They remind us that innovation has always been about paying attention to what's actually happening, rather than clinging to what we think should happen. Hugh Cameron died in 1903. 20 years after the avalanche that proved his design. He's buried in that Colorado Valley, on the slope above where his shelter once stood, overlooking the community that learned from his example. His daughter Mary lived to be 90, and she told the story of that terrible night and her father's wisdom until her own death in the 1950s. Because of them, because of one man's willingness to build differently, and one community's willingness to learn from tragedy, lives were saved that might otherwise have been lost. That's the real legacy, not the technical innovation, but the human chain of knowledge passed down, refined, and put to use. In the end, that's what all these frontier stories are about. People figuring out how to survive in places that could kill them, and having the grace to teach others what they'd learned.